It's time for us to check back in with Alex Stewart and see what happens next. If you've missed any of the previous readings, just look in the description below for a playlist. Chapter 16, A Head Full of Memories. They was a war over here at Mulberry Gap. It is extremely difficult for one generation of people to understand the history, culture, and true feelings of a group of people who have preceded them. The manner in which history is traditionally taught in our schools does little toward addressing this problem. How, for example, can we truly understand the beliefs, fears, loves, and aspirations of our pioneer ancestors by studying the Monroe Doctrine, the physical problems of 1837, the French-British dispute, or the merits of the gold standard? While these subjects are important, they reflect at best the thoughts and philosophies of a handful of political activists, scholars, and entrepreneurs. There is little in most history books which can help us understand the hard-working, God-fearing, common people who comprised maybe 90% of the population at any given time. In order for us to know these people, one needs to understand their daily lives by looking beyond election results, economic policies, and the speeches made by the statesmen of the day. Alex Stewart provides a glimpse into the past through his memories of his neighbors and their day-to-day routine. Few historians could be in more detail than he. It is true that he made no photographs, rendered no drawings, and didn't know the meaning of physical independence, demography, population mobility, or economic deprivation. He wrote nothing down, yet he indelibly inscribed in his mind the deeds, plights, and feelings of his people. This chapter is devoted to these reminiscences of long ago events which happened on and near Newman's Ridge. He talks on such varied topics as the mysterious Melungeons, the time he was bit by a mad dog, the George Ball murder, and smaller things such as the first time he saw a watch and how his grandfather could make wooden ropes. These are topics of little importance, except that the knowledge of them helps us to understand the private lives and thinking of those people on Newman's Ridge and, in a broader sense, frontier people in general. Alex often mentioned the Jesse Maxey family who lived near his childhood home on Newman's Ridge. The story of this family is a classic example of the American rags to riches epic. It embodies a lesson for those who believe that all dire poverty is the result of shiftlessness on the part of the poor themselves. I was just sitting here yesterday studying about the Maxey family. I'd give anything, of course they ain't many of them left now, but I'd give anything to see them. Law, at the hard times they did have. They'd take them an old basket in the fall of the year and go out in the woods and gather wild grapes and persimmons, black haws, and pawpaws to live on. I've knowed them to have pawpaws for breakfast and just a little parched corn for dinner and supper. Jesse finally got a hold of a few dollars, and he bought an old worn-out sawmill and set it up at the foot of the ridge. The outfit was so no account that it would take him a half a day to saw 2 or 3 logs, but he was a worker, and he just kept working at it till he saved up a little money, and he pulled out and went to Oklahoma. Well, when he got out there and bought him a little place, every bit of money he had left was 50 cents. Now, you talk about hard. He lived hard for 8 or 10 years. He sold an option on his place for them to dig for oil, and they come in there and struck oil right away. They struck a gusher, and it just gushed out of the ground for 7 years, and they didn't even have to pump it. He got 700 barrels a day for his part. He built a town out there, and he owned the whole thing. One of the girls, Mary was her name, was the first teacher that I ever had. Pap was a member of the school board, and he give her a school way out on the ridge. After they got rich, she would come in here often, and we'd sit and talk about what a hard time they had before they left here. Once when Alex was talking about the hogs running wild in the mountains, he was reminded of a man in Kentucky who decided to build a rail fence around a large section of mountain land he owned, and this reminded him of a rather risque story. There were 3 fellers that lived right up the creek that got a job over in Kentucky. Old Fleenor Gibson, Jim Gibson, and Crockett Miser was their names. They undertook to cut and split rails and fence in 100 acres on the mountain over here on the edge of Kentucky for a man named Jenkins. Old man Jenkins soon died. He was a rich man, and he left his wife all kinds of money. She asked them to go on and finish the fence for her so the hogs could run in there. Every week, these 3 men would come back home for the weekend. One Sunday afternoon, as they was walking back to Kentucky, a feller stopped them and begged to go along. His name was Pete, and he was about to starve. He wanted to go with them and work. They got a penny a rail, and he wanted to make a little money to buy something to eat. Fleenor said Pete was a big old strapping feller, stout as a mule, but not worth a dime to work. Said he was absolutely no account, but he kept begging, and finally they agreed to let him go. They went back up there and cut rails all Monday morning, and at noontime they come down to a big spring to eat. This spring was across the road from where the widow Jenkins lived, and she come out to bring them some buttermilk to go with their dinner. They said she was the best-looking woman in that whole country. Well, she brought that buttermilk out, and she seed Pete sitting up there on the bank, and his clothes was just wore off of him. He was so poor. She stood there and talked to Fleenor, and every once in a while she'd glance over at Pete. Finally, she got her milk jug and started back toward the house, and she asked Pete if he'd like to come with her. He was so bashful he wouldn't go. Finally, she said, "I've got a lot of good clothes that my husband left, and I'd like to give you some." Well, that pleased him, and he went along. Well, them fellers kept sitting there waiting for Pete to come out of the house, and he never did. They started hollering for him to come on, and still he didn't come. In a little while, she stuck her head out the window and said, "You all go on about your fence building. Pete's not going." Well, them men went back on the mountain and worked for the rest of the day. They come down a little before dark, and there sat Pete, all reared back in a chair on the front porch of the house. He had on a white shirt and a necktie and a black suit. They didn't hardly recognize him. He was so dressed up. She kept Pete on there for years and wouldn't let him get out and work. Of course, he wouldn't have worked nohow. He stayed there as long as she lived, and when she died, she willed him the farm and all her money. Now, Fleenor told me that more than once, and he was an awful good man and never accused of lying. He swore that was the truth. Perhaps the most mystery-shrouded group of people in America are the Melungeons, who lived on Newman's Ridge near Alex's boyhood home. As was pointed out earlier, it was my fascination with these people which first led me to the area. Although the researchers, writers, and historians who have studied them differ on several aspects of the Melungeons, there are a few areas of agreement. First of all, historical evidence seems to bear out the commonly held belief that they were living there when the first white pioneers arrived. It is further agreed that the Melungeons had characteristics distinctly different from the surrounding Anglo-Saxon population. Henry R. Price, an attorney from nearby Rogersville, has done extensive studies and writings on the subject. He described them as having an olive-like dark skin and straight black hair. Their eyes range in color, he observes, from coal black to dark brown to deep purple to gray. He points out that they have high cheekbones like the Cherokee, but thin lips and narrow faces. Jean Patterson Bible has also done extensive studies on the Melungeons and has published a book, The Melungeon, Yesterday and Today, on her findings. She, like others, concludes that the origin of these people remains a mystery. There are, however, several theories. Perhaps the most popular hypothesis is that they are of Portuguese descent. According to this theory, Portuguese sailors shipwrecked off the coast of North Carolina, intermarried with the Indians, and eventually made their way inland. There are several sub-theories. One is that the Portuguese were Christianized Moors who fled to the New World in order to escape the Inquisition. Price points out that it is a matter of historical record that in 1665, Portugal dispatched a fleet of ships in Cuba and that they were never heard from again. The most common Melungeon names are Goins, Collins, Brogans, and Mullins. Price points out that these names might be Portuguese derivations of Magoins, Colenso, Braganza, and Mullins. It is easy to imagine how these names could have been anglicized to their present spelling and pronunciation. But there are numerous other theories. Some believe the Melungeons are descendants of the lost colony of Roanoke Island, who intermarried with the Indians. Those who support this theory offer as evidence the fact that the Melungeon people from the earliest time have had English names. A third theory is that the Melungeons are descendants of the Carthaginians who first came to Portugal and from there to the New World. According to this premise, they landed near the North Carolina-South Carolina border and then later came into upper East Tennessee. Judge Lewis Shepard of Chattanooga, while arguing a lawsuit involving the Melungeons in 1872, stated that they were pure-blooded Carthaginians. There are those who feel that the Melungeons sprang from some of De Soto's troops who either deserted or were lost from the main party. There is strong evidence that De Soto passed through what is now Tennessee in 1540, and a number of his men were never accounted for. There are other theories of which seem as plausible as those discussed above, but the fact that there continues to be numerous such theories is evidence within itself that the origin of the Melungeons remains shrouded in mystery. As Gene Bible points out, the origin of the word Melungeon, as it is applied to this group of people, is also mysterious. Here again, there are several theories. Perhaps the most accepted one is that the word is derived from the French word Melangeon, Melungeon, I guess, meaning mixed breed. French traders and trappers were in this area long before the English and could very easily have first applied the term Melungeon. My first personal encounter with the Melungeons occurred when, at the age of 18, I borrowed my father's old Plymouth and, along with a college friend, drove to the heart of Melungeon country on Newman's Ridge. The trail, which served as the only road to the area, got rougher and more rocky as we neared the top of the ridge, and it wasn't long before we were hopelessly stuck. When we opened the car door to survey our plight, we were literally struck with the strong odor of moonshine whiskey. I had heard that the favorite occupational pursuit of these people was the making of illicit whiskey. I had also heard that they frowned upon strangers coming unannounced into their midst, and I'd even read stories about strangers who never returned from the Melungeon settlement. But here we were, completely immobile, doubtlessly within a few yards of an operating still. My friend knew some of the families, having become acquainted with them when they had worked occasionally as farmhands for his father. We agreed that he should go for help. He approached a tiny log cabin, the only sign of civilization we could see. In a few minutes, two middle-aged men came out, accompanied by half a dozen boys, ranging in ages from their early to late teens. On their way to our car, they were joined by three other men. When this strange-looking band reached the car, they surveyed the situation. They muttered gutturally among themselves, and I understood not a word. They were gaunt and ragged, and their hair was long, unkempt, and dark. None were clean-shaven, but as I recall, none had long beards. I doubted if there had ever been an automobile on this rocky wagon road before, but they seemed to know what to do. Some of the men went into the woods and broke off bundles of twigs and small limbs. They motioned for me to start the motor and attempt to go forward. As I did so, some of the men fed the twigs under the spinning wheels while the others pushed. The smell of burning rubber on the boulders soon dominated the whiskey scent, but the car didn't move. I started to get out, but one of the older men motioned for me to try again. Everyone seemed to push harder, and the car inched forward over the slick rock until the tires caught on the branches and we were free. I thanked them, even offered to pay them, and again they responded in barely audible and totally incoherent manner. There was no laughter among them, not even a smile. After we were a few hundred yards down the tree-shouldered lane, I looked back and saw our benefactors, motionless silhouettes, watching our departure. Alex brought up the subject of Melungeons when I was talking to him on a very cold night in December 1981 when he was in his 91st year. He was an authority on so many subjects, I was anxious to hear his comments on this fascinating topic. Where do you think the Melungeons come from? I don't know. We ain't got no history of where they come from. I've heard my granddaddy talk about them a sight. When I was about 8 or 9 years old, I went with my dad back up there and we seen plenty of them. There was an old man who lived about middle ways up the ridge by the name of Williams. He was an old pensioner and he got Pap to make him 6 chairs and he couldn't come and get them, so I went with Pap to deliver them. Poor old feller, He just couldn't hardly get out of his chair, and he said, "Now, Mr. Stewart, you watch them folks going back out of here. Don't you have nothing to do with them. They're liable to stick a knife in you." What kind of houses did they have? All they had was just huts, didn't have no floors in them. They'd have poles laid down to make a rectangular pen, and they'd fill that with straw, shucks, and stuff to sleep in. The men wore deer hides for shoes. They called them moccasins. You couldn't understand hardly anything they'd say. Their hair would come down along here, Alex pointed below his shoulders, and it was just as black as a crow. How did they make a living? Oh, they just lived out of the woods like animals, wild animals. And they didn't have any furniture in the huts? Oh no, just had poles and rails to sit on. Wasn't a chair in the house, nor a bedstead. The chimney wasn't no higher than that mantel there. It was on the outside and just high enough to keep from burning down the logs. You really couldn't call it a chimney, just a rock pile. And they didn't have no stoves nor nothing like that. They'd broil their meat in the fire. Around the house, they'd clean up and make a little patch of corn. Time it got to be roasting ears, they'd start eating it and keep right on till it got so hard they couldn't eat it. After it got hard, they'd put it in the ashes, shuck and all, and parch it till it got brown. Their cheekbones just stuck way out, and their nose was long. I've studied about them, and I've dreamed about them many a time. They's a whole lot told on them that wasn't right, according to what my granddaddy told me. Some of the older ones would try to be friendly with you. You could tell by their actions that they wanted to be good to you. And you say that you couldn't understand them? No, shoot. I could understand a goose just as good as I could understand them. Did they speak some foreign language? I couldn't tell what kind of language they did have. It was so funny, jabber, jabber, jabber. It was so fast you couldn't understand anything they said at all. They'd point and show us what they wanted. They knowed we couldn't understand them. Called a watch a sats. Pap had a watch, and when he pulled it out and looked at it, they pointed and said sats, sats. I've never heard that word before, have you? Never heard it before nor since. Now, when them Presbyterians started coming up there, they helped them a sight and got them to where they could talk to you. Oh, they worked at it the hardest, getting them straightened out. Before that, they didn't know a letter in the book. Do you think the Melungeons were part Indian? No, sir, I don't believe they was. They was darker than the Indians, and they was rougher in a way than the Indians. The older ones was. Did they call themselves Melungeons? Did they object to being called Melungeon? No, they wanted you to call them Melungeons. That's what they was. I've heard that they come originally from Portugal or Spain. Did you ever hear that? Well, I heard lots of places where they come from, but they don't know a bit more than I do when you get right down to it. They're just a-putting on a lot of stuff, just a-guessing at it. A heap of people think they got shipwrecked way back yonder. They sure seen a hard time. Why, I bet they's lots of days they didn't have a bite to eat. They'd raise a few taters and eat them as long as they lasted. Then, through the winter, they just hunted for their living. Most of them didn't have a pot in the house to cook in. They'd do their cooking in the fire. They was 15 miles down through there that they wasn't hardly a cleared field to grow a crop. Nobody lived in there but them and that old man Williams. They lived on that ridge from one end to other. I'm not certain whether or not Mahali Mullins was a Melungeon, but she lived amongst them and was likely blood related. I am quite certain that she was the best known person ever to live on Newman's Ridge, except, of course, Alex Stewart. I'd heard stories about this fabulous woman long before I visited the area and long before I knew Alex. In the early part of this century, her fame spread beyond Hancock County, and she became the subject of numerous newspaper and magazine articles. Both the oral and written stories about Mahali varied greatly, but there was general agreement on certain aspects of her life, notably that she was a lifelong bootlegger and that she was a woman of enormous size. According to some accounts, she was so large that it was necessary to take down one end of the log house in order to remove her when she died. I knew that Alex had known this matriarch of Newman's Ridge, and I was anxious to hear his version of her. He smiled broadly when I asked him if he remembered Mahali Mullins. Lord, I can just see her as plain as I can see you. You don't remember her? No, you couldn't. She's been dead 60 or 70 years. Well, I was just a small boy, and Uncle George Levacy had a girl that took the measles. They wouldn't break out on her, and she was about to die. They told Uncle George to get some liquor and give her, and that would sure break them out if anything would. He come by to get me to go up and show him where Aunt Haley lived. I was just a boy, but I knowed where she lived. We went up there to the old log house where she lived and went in, and she was a-laying there on an old rope bed. She had a keg of liquor under her bed, and she had a siphoning hose she used to draw it out. She had a little tin cup to measure it in, and that was the first tin cup that ever I seed. I thought it was the funniest looking thing. She was so big she couldn't walk. They said she weighed 700 pounds, but they was just guessing. They had no way to weigh her. Uncle George told her what he wanted, and she siphoned him out about a pint, measured it out in that little cup. Oh, she was something to see. And the sheriff never bothered her? Oh, people would turn her in every once in a while, and the law would have to go up there and arrest her. When they arrested her, she'd just lay there, and there was nothing they could do. They couldn't get her out of the house, let alone carry her off that ridge. Alex laughed. Never did get her down to the jailhouse that I knowed of, and she laid there and bootlegged as long as she lived. Her boys made the liquor for her, and she sold it. I've heard that they had to tear down part of the house when she died in order to get her out. They couldn't get her out. They just left her in the bed and made the coffin around the bed. Then, of course, they couldn't get the coffin out of the house. There was a great wide chimney in the house, and they tore that chimney down so that they could get her out. They just drug her a little ways out from the house and buried her. They had to take the entire chimney down to get her out? Yeah, it wasn't a very high chimney, though. Back then, the chimneys, a lot of them, just went up 6 or 8 feet high. Did you ever hear of a stick and mud chimney? That's the kind we had at home. Mama had a great gang of turkeys, and they was a big old black gobbler in the bunch. All the hen turkeys roosted down below the house, but that old gobbler got to roosting on top of that stick and mud chimney. That warm air drawing through it felt good to him on a cold night, I guess, and that's where he roosted. Well, one night, Mama was cooking a big pot of mush. She had it hanging on the fireplace, and that turkey crapped down the chimney in that pot of mush. Oh, that made her mad, and the next day she had me kill that gobbler, and that's the only one she had. The next spring, one of the turkey hens disappeared and stayed gone all summer. I was setting on the porch one day, and here she come flying in. We drove her in the barn and caught her, and she was so poor she couldn't hardly walk. Come to find out, she'd been setting on a nest of eggs all summer, and they wouldn't hatch because she hadn't been with a gobbler. She had sat on them eggs for 4 months and had just about starved. I think you mentioned once driving turkeys to market. Oh, you can drive them just like cattle, but when the sun starts to go down, they'll find them a tree and go to roost. Once they take a notion to go to roost, you had to just as well hang it up. It's all over for the day. I used to drive turkeys from here over here on Blackwater all the time. Me and Margie raised more turkeys than anybody around here. They'd buy up turkeys down here at Sneedville till they had several hundred. Then they'd drive them clear over to Rogersville or Morristown to be shipped out. Took 2 or 3 days sometimes. Did you ever go on a cattle drive? I've helped drive 2 herds. We drove them to Ben-Hur, Virginia, and loaded them in railroad cars to be shipped to Lexington, Kentucky. The cattle belonged to old man Drennan. He would go all over this country buying up cattle. He would wear old ragged clothes and his shoes half gone in the mud and snow. That was the tackiest looking man that you ever saw, but he was worth more than every man in this country. He had a big farm, and he owned 7 stores. He had the successfulest dog I ever seen in my life. He'd tell that dog which direction to drive them cattle, and he'd keep them in the road. If there was a fork in the road, he'd tell that dog which road to take. What did you do with the herd at night? We'd stop at somebody's house and spend the night. There was an old man by the name of Hines that lived right on the road over on Walden's Creek. We'd feed the cattle there and stay the night. I don't think you ever told me the full story about the time you got mad dog bit. Well, my oldest girl, Mary, started walking to school one morning. Just a little while after she left, I heard her screaming, and I run down there to see what was the matter. When I got there, a big dog had a hold on her, and it was just about to eat her up. I had bought her a fine yarn sweater for her to wear to school, paid $5 for it, and that dog had just tore that sweater plumb off her. I grabbed me the biggest rock I could find and hit that dog in the head and knocked him down, but before I could get a hold of another rock, he jumped up and grabbed me by the leg and wouldn't let go. I finally twisted around and got on top of him and got both hands around his neck, but he just held on to my leg. He sunk his teeth almost to the bone. I tried to get my knife out to stab him through the heart, but I couldn't do it. There was a boy down below me on the side of the ridge plowing, and I hollered for him to come up there. He come running and pulled out a .38 pistol and shot that dog right through the head, and me a-holding him. That feller went on back to plowing, and I took Mary back to the house. She was scared to death. I got her some clothes on, and after we got her sort of pacified, I went back to bury the dog. When I got back, I found he was gone. He'd gone up to Break Queener's place and killed a great big pup, and he was standing over that pup with slobber running out of his mouth. We got a shotgun and killed him, and I got to studying about it, and I said, "There's something wrong with that dog. I didn't know he's mad at the time. I didn't want to think he's mad, but rather than take a chance, I went and got an axe and cut his head off and put it in a bucket and got some ice and put in it, and then I took it to Knoxville. It took me all day to go to Knoxville, about 70 miles. My uncle had a T-model car, and that was the only car in this country. When I got there, it was dark, and all the doctors had quit and gone home. We went to a feller by the name of Albert Burkett. I was raised up here with him and played with him when we was little boys, and he married a second cousin. He was a big businessman and got to be president of a big company in Nashville. Well, he finally managed to get a doctor to meet us at the hospital. He laid that dog's head on the table and split it wide open with a hatchet. He took a little piece of glass and a little paddle and put some of them brains on that glass and put it under one of them microscopes. He looked over at me and said, "Now don't let this scare you." I said, "Why, go ahead. It won't scare me none." He said, "The dog's mad. He's got the very worst case of it." He said they was 3 kinds and this was the worst kind. He wanted to know when he bit me, and I told him. Now, he said, "It's already been 2 days and you and that girl have to take shots, and you have to start right now." He let me look through the microscope, and I swear you could see them little bitty things a-twisting and a-crawling over one another. They wasn't no longer than a gnat, and they was finer than a thread. They looked like maggots crawling in something dead. That man who studied and made that microscope, he sure knew what he was doing. Alex had just been told that he and his daughter had been bitten by a rabid dog, and yet he was still observant enough to remember the microscope and describe it in detail after half a century, a clear indication of his fabulous curiosity and his interest in everything he encountered. He sent the medicine to Dr. Trent there in Sneedville, and I had to take 21 shots, and Mary had to take 18. We'd walk from home every day there and get our shots. On our way down there one day, we passed an old man's house, and he said, "Are you the man who got mad dog bit?" And I said, "I was." He said, "Well, I don't want a thing to do with you," and he was walking by right fast while he was talking. He said, "I got attacked by a madman once, and it took 7 men to pull him off of me. They had to tie that man up to a tree just like a dog, and nobody could get near him. They had to throw his food to him." Now, I thought to myself that was a lot of encouragement, him thinking I was going mad. Well, I did come in 9/10 of going mad. On the 3rd trip down there to get my shot, I didn't know nothing. I don't even remember going down there. But when I finally come to myself, I was standing in the jailhouse door talking to the jailer's wife, and she was a-backing up, just scared to death. I went up to the docks and got my shot, and I was telling him about it, and he said, "Son, If you'd been just one day later starting the shots, you would have never made it. It didn't bother Mary as much as it did me, 'cause she had on that sweater and them heavy clothes, but he bit me right through the leg. You can see the scar there yet." Alex rolled his overalls up to show the 70-year-old scar. "Now, I wouldn't go through that again for all the land from here to Sneedville. A man don't know how painful them shots is till he goes through them. They tell me they've got a lot better way of taking care of that now, and it ain't near so hurtful. As far as the writer knows, there is no known treatment for a victim of rabies once the symptoms appear, and before the modern vaccine, there was no effective medical treatment for those bitten by a rabid animal. Certain agents such as opium, belladonna, bromide of potash, and ether had been tried, but without avail. I'd heard vague references to a pioneer remedy which involved the use of what was called a madstone. These madstones were very rare, and I'd never found a single person who had ever seen one. Since we were on the subject of mad dogs, I decided to ask Alex about them. Alex, did you ever hear of a madstone?" "Madstone? Oh, yeah, I've seed two in my life. Old Dr. Livingston had one, the first I'd seed. It was about the size of the palm of your hand. It wasn't exactly round, sort of squarish, and it had little tiny holes all in it. They come out of the stomachs of deer, and that's the only place you'll ever find one, and there's not one deer out of 50 that'll have one. The other one I saw belonged to an old man over here. Aw, shucks, I can't think of nothing no more. McGee, old man McGee had one. When you got bit by a mad dog, they claimed you could put a madstone right over the bite and it'd stick there until it absorbed all the poison. Then it would just drop off. A madstone was worth all kinds of money." Interesting portion of the book as Alex remembers and shares stories from so long ago. I especially like how this part started kind of with what John Rice was talking about the importance of history, but about how the important parts of history, a lot of times, of course, you need to know the big picture. You need to know all the things like the ones that he mentioned and how America was founded and all those kind of things. But there is really something to be said for the history of day-to-day life, of those little simple everyday things that we all have in common. From sitting out in the yard to growing a garden to just all those little daily things that seem kind of inconsequential and unimportant. But as you get older, you realize those are the important things of life. So I really liked that part of where he kind of started off with that. He was making that point, John Rice was. The Maxey family, that was really interesting because that was like a true life Jed Clampett story. You know, they moved to Oklahoma and then the bubbling crude come bubbling up. So that was really interesting. I liked that part of the story, and about that even after they were well off, how the daughter would come back and talk to Alex. So that was nice. I liked that part of it. The whole part about the rabies part is real scary. Of course, every year it seems like you'll hear somebody say, you know, there's a rabid, maybe a coon or something like that that's like in a neighborhood or in a community and they're looking for it, or somebody killed one or whatever. Not so much dogs today because so many people, of course, have shots. You know, you can get the shots for your dogs, for your animals. But it's still a problem for things like raccoons and skunks and different things. But that part of it reminded me, Pap would always, he called that, and a lot of older people did, hydrophobia. So they called that if you got like a dog that was mad or had rabies, hydrophobia. So Pap would often tease if he was sick with a cold or something like that, he would tease that he had the hydrophobia, you know. He was just joking about it, but that was a term that you'd hear often in reference to mad dogs. So just another fascinating little glimpse into the memories of Alex Stewart. We're getting ever closer to the end. I think we've got maybe two more readings before we reach the end of the book. I hope that you've enjoyed it as much as I have. I hope you'll leave a comment and tell me what jumped out at you from this portion. And as always, I hope you drop back by next Friday because we've got to see what happens next as we get closer and closer to the end of the book.